Well, I thank my colleague for his leadership on this issue. It's been a pleasure to lead a subcommittee in the Foreign Relations Committee with Senator Merkley, and we've worked always in a constructive fashion on some consequential issues, and none more consequential than the one before us here today. With respect to the crisis in Burma, we recently met with the lead person on an international NGO who just returned from camps in Bangladesh. And he briefed us on some of the horrible circumstances facing these individuals that have been forced out of Burma. We also led a letter, as Senator Merkley indicated, the letter being to Ambassador Haley, and that was just last Friday, regarding the Burma crisis. I'd also note that we had an important hearing on this topic yesterday in the full Foreign Relations Committee, and commend our leadership for putting that together. I want to share some of my thoughts about this crisis, but before I do, I'd like to acknowledge folks back home, back in the state of Indiana. I happen to represent a significant number of Burmese Americans. These are patriotic fellow Hoosiers who have played an instrumental role in helping to educate me and members of my team on this crisis, and I'm happy we can be responsive to their concerns. It's important for all Americans, though, to understand what's happening in America, in America and everything outside of our shores. Burma is a country that doesn't typically capture the imagination or attention of people here in the United States, but right now, in light of this humanitarian crisis, it requires all of our attention. The Burmese military has conducted a deplorable campaign of violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority, including the systematic use of arson, murder, and rape. Now, our State Department tells us that nearly 300 villages have been either partially or completely destroyed by fire just since August 25th of this year by the Burmese military. That's more than half of the approximately 470 Muslim villages in northern Rakhine State. Ambassador Haley has indicated that the Burmese military's actions constitute a sustained campaign to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority, ethnic cleansing. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has referred to this situation as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. We've seen more than 600,000, mostly of the Rohingya ethnic minority, flee their violence in the Rakhine State and seek refuge in Bangladesh. You travel on foot for days, carrying what they can of their belongings, carrying their young children. It's mostly women and children who make this trek. And upon arrival in Bangladesh, we've been briefed that many require immediate, life-saving assistance. Now, to put this severity in some measure of context, yesterday, our Department of State and U.S. Agency for International Development characterized the resulting population movement as almost unprecedented amidst all the other challenges we've seen in recent years, including the migrant crisis coming out of the Middle East and across the shores of the Mediterranean. Some research suggests the refugee flow from Burma has been swifter than the exodus from Rwanda in 1994. Many Americans will say, you know, honestly, we have a lot of challenges in the world. Why should I care about this one? Well, here's why. In Burma, we see a group of people, the Rohingya, being systematically targeted because of their ethnicity. This, of course, runs afoul of our basic values, the principles upon which our country was founded. And you know, these principles inform the rules of the international order that have existed for some number of decades now. These rules are the mortar that holds the order together. We simply cannot allow certain rules of international behavior to be violated, or that will encourage other bad actors and they'll continue to be undermined, thus undermining our interests, our national interests. Recent history demonstrates that the systematic violation of fundamental human rights, sooner or later, engenders security threats to Americans, to our allies, and to our collective interests. Think of Tunisia, think of Syria, think of the country of Yemen or Nigeria. There are almost countless examples just in recent history where we've seen or are seeing right now the deprivation of basic human rights, and that in turn is undermining our values and our national interests. Let me apply this observation about the linkage between our values and our interests, not just domestically but internationally, to the situation in Burma. Now, we know that the past and present Burmese governments have systematically deprived the Rohingya population of their most fundamental human rights. Not surprisingly, this has compelled a small number to join the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA. The most recent wave of ethnic cleansing began after ARSA conducted a coordinated attack on Burmese security outposts. And the Burmese military responded with disproportionate military actions and deplorable attacks on civilians. Now, here's a point the Burmese government and the Burmese military must understand. By refusing to treat the Rohingya as full and equal citizens, and by attacking their own people, they just want to live in peace, the Burmese military is only going to increase the number of Rohingyas who will be radicalized, exacerbating the very problem the Burmese military says it's trying to address. So this is not in Burma's interest. I can't emphasize that enough. In December 2016, before the most recent iteration of this crisis, the International Crisis Group, an international non-governmental organization, issued a report titled Myanmar, a new Muslim insurgency in Rakhine State. The report said a number of things, among them the continued use of disproportionate force that has driven tens of thousands from their homes or across the border to Bangladesh could create conditions for further radicalizing sections of the Rohingya population that transnational jihadists could exploit. Again, as we saw in Syria, to choose just one comparative example, when a government fails to respect the basic human rights of their citizenry and conflict ensues, it can lead to far wider radicalization. The conflict becomes a magnet for international terrorists. It becomes a factory creating more international terrorists. In short, when governments commit systematic and large-scale violence, oppression, and injustice against its own people, it creates fertile ground for Islamist terrorist recruitment and radicalization. And this is contrary to the interests of everyone, including the Burmese government. Further, if left unaddressed, the humanitarian and security situation in Burma and Bangladesh will worsen and increasingly threaten regional stability and U.S. national security interests. So the U.S. must continue to lead. There has to be an international response in Burma. We need other partners to step up and participate in that response, but the U.S. must continue to lead. And part of leading comes down to clarity. What do we want of the Burmese government? Well, I see at least four things that the Burmese government must do. First, the Burmese government and their military must immediately end its ethnic cleansing campaign against the Rohingya. Second, the Burmese government must address the root of this conflict by implementing the recommendations of a UN panel, the so-called Advisory Commission on Rakhine State. Third, the Burmese government must permit safe access for journalists, for humanitarians, and for a United Nations fact-finding mission and all of their personnel, so that we can figure out precisely what is going on and who is responsible. And finally, the Burmese government must facilitate the safe and voluntary return of all these individuals who've been displaced. Now, when I leave the Senate floor today, I'm scheduled to immediately visit with Burma's ambassador to the United States. And the points I just mentioned are points I intend to reiterate directly to that ambassador. Moving forward, the United States should lead efforts to document atrocities in Burma however we can, so that the perpetrators can be held accountable. I also support the administration's announcement yesterday that it is exploring accountability mechanisms that are already available under U.S. law, including the so-called global Magnitsky targeted sanctions. And I call on countries like China and Russia to support the suspension of all international weapons sales to the Burmese military. They should not be transferring weapons to this murderous regime. So in conclusion, as Senator Merkley and I stated in our letter on Friday to Ambassador Haley, now is the time. Now is the time to take bold and effective actions against the Burmese government to end the violence, not just to help the Burmese people, but to help stabilize the region and protect U.S. national security interests. Now is the time to uphold our fundamental values, the values, frankly, of civilized nations. Now is the time to work with this administration and colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure that we can reach as peaceful and as positive resolution to this horrible situation as possible. I want to close by once again acknowledging the tremendous leadership of Senator Merkley. I want to thank him for his partnership on this effort. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.